Hello everyone, this is MMA Sherdog for the Bluff to Spot High Stakes course. In this video I am going to cover in-position play, specifically in-position play in a single race pot. I think in-position play is one of the most important spots to master, not only because it comes up very frequently, but because there's so much room for adjustments. And you can make pretty big deviations against your opponents because they all play so differently. So first, we're going to cover pre-flop. Our open raising ranges change per stake. At lower stakes, people tend to under-defend their blinds, and they should defend tighter because the rake is much higher. So because your opponents fold their blinds more often, you can raise more often, because if you raise and they fold, you win the full 1.5 big blinds in the pot, but if they call, they pay a lot of rake. So at lower stakes, you can open raise wider, especially from the button and the cutoff. In early and mid position, I don't recommend opening that wide because you have more recreational players who flat in position. And sure, they play a bit weaker and they have wider ranges. So if you start opening a hand like King 10 offsuit under the gun and lose recreationals flat in position, it's not like you'll be able to use that hand to make a lot of money. So I prefer playing a little bit tighter in EP and MP and raising a wider range in the cutoff and on the button. When you're deep stacked, you can open a little bit wider. You mostly have to raise more hands like suited aces, suited kings, suited connectors that can make the sky straights, and start being a little bit tighter with the unplayable hands such as King 10, for instance. When playing short, King 10 goes way up in value, whereas a hand like 5-4 suited goes way down in value. You're also going to have to open raise a bit tighter, otherwise you're going to get 3-bet to death, and it's a little bit more difficult to call out 3-bets because on the flop or the turn, you'll usually be all in. So it's difficult to realize a lot of equity by calling multiple streets. Adjusting versus the recreational player is extremely important. As I said, not raising too wide from the first two positions I think is important. And then we can open raise wider when the recreational player is in the big blind. If he's on the button, when you're on the cutoff, I would not recommend raising a wider range because the same thing happens. You'll start raising unplayable hands like King 9 offsuit, Jack 9 offsuit, Ace 5 offsuit, and then if the button flats, you're not going to be able to c-bet this hand and barrel off with it effectively. You cannot hit a flush using both cards. You're going to often just hit a gut shot on the flop and the turn. So these hands should just be folded. But if a recreational player is in the big blind, at least you can play your hand in position and you can check back more flops. If there's a recreational player behind you who, let's say, 3-bets way too much, then we're opening a tighter range. And when they don't 3-bet, their range is extra weak and we can go extra thinly for value. So make sure to not categorize somebody as a recreational player or a regular, but look at how they play. So use your HUD stats and your overall reads on recreational players in your player pool to build a player profile, because every recreational player is different. Most of them are fairly loose and passive, so they'll open too many hands, especially from early position. They won't fold enough to 3-bets, they won't 4-bet enough, and they generally don't like folding post flop because they play too many hands, so when they finally hit something good, they don't have the patience to fold and wait for a better spot to come up. Onto the flop. There's many different c-bet strategies you can use, and I think that all of them make a lot of sense. So I'm going to try and explain how I approach it and how I think that you as the viewer should be approaching it. So first, I'll be covering depolarized c-betting. We c-bet a depolarized range in position on boards that are either very good for imposition or boards that just don't really hit either player, but because in position raised and out of position merely called, in position is still far ahead. Then I'll be covering a couple of boards on which we see bet polarized. So boards that hit in position hard, but also hit out of position hard. Those are boards on which you cannot just get away with a blind third pot c-bet. Your c-bet strategy also changes per position. So if you raise in a button big blind situation, you can c-bet far more because both ranges are quite wide, and you'll be betting thinly on boards where villain just doesn't hit anything. But in an EP versus big blind spot, both ranges are very strong. So it's very difficult for the big blind not to have any piece of the board unless the board is extremely dry. So there, you want to generally size up and be a bit more polarized. So we're also going to look at how to c-bet from different positions. Which brings me to point 4, the simplified strategy versus what I call freestyling. So on many boards, we can c-bet 75 to 80% plus, and we tend to simplify our strategy and c-bet our full range. It is much easier to play a range as a pure c-bet, so you'll be making far fewer mistakes, and you barely give up on any EV. There's some boards on which you could conceivably use that strategy as well as mixing it up. Of course, when you freestyle, you're going to make more mistakes, but your opponent is also going to make more mistakes. In position, I prefer a complicated strategy over out of position, because in position, we can at least pot control more easily. And we're going to talk about facing a check raise, because when we see bet at a high frequency, villain should generally be check raising between 10 and 20%. So this comes up quite often. King 4-3 rainbow is an example of a board on which we can see bet with a depolarized range. So this is button versus big blind, and you'll see that we're c-betting near 95% of the time. Because the 4 and the 3 don't really improve out of position much, and the king is better for in position. And out of position also doesn't have many high equity draws. Only hands like 5-6 suited, 5-7 suited, etc. So we can see bet here at a very high frequency, which means we'll be simplifying our strategy and just betting our full range. Similar boards to these are the ace-high boards or the dry paired boards on which villain doesn't hit many trips. So a board like 8-8-5 flush draw is way different than a board like 7 deuce deuce, because out of position hits the 8 quite often, but the deuce basically never. On paired boards, you can generally over c-bet the flop because villain has to check raise at a very high frequency, which they tend not to do, at least not aggressively enough. So on any really dry board where in position doesn't really have to be worried about out of position improving, we can c-bet off our full range. 10-9-4 flush draw is completely different, however. You'll see that pie solver checks back 40% of the time and prefers a large bet. So I allowed pie solver to bet full pot as well as 1/3 pot, and you'll see that it chooses to only use a big sizing. That makes a lot of sense because out of position hits this board very hard. Out of position has lots of 10s, lots of 9s, lots of straight draws like king queen, king jack, queen jack, queen 8, jack 8, jack 7, 8-7, 8-6, flush draws, some good ace highs like, let's say, ace 8 of hearts, ace jack offsuit, etc. The 4 out of position doesn't hit too much, to be fair, but it's a board on which it's very difficult for out of position to have nothing. Now, in position has all of those hands as well, and it even has pocket 10s, pocket 9s, which big blind probably would have 3-bet. So it's a strong range versus strong range spot, which means we generally want to size up. So then we run this board again. So this is the final output when only betting full pot. You'll see we're checking a little bit more because we're not allowed to bet small. So let's look at some tendencies here. Most of our strong hands are being bet. So you'll see that ace 10 right here is basically always being bet. And then when we go down in kicker, we see bet less often. Obviously, two pair always gets bet, but then when you look at 10-8, 10-7, 10-6, we bet less often again. So we see bet top pair strong kicker, but sometimes check back top pair weak kicker. When deciding on which 10-8 to bet, you first pick the ones with the best equity. So you'll see that 10-8 of hearts gets bet 41.5% of the time because it has the backdoor flush draw. But 10-8 of spades and 10-8 of clubs rarely get bet. So when you have additional equity to go with your hand, you bet it more often than when you don't. You also have to just look at how good the board is overall. This board is good for imposition, but not incredible, so we have to have quite a significant check back range. 9x is an even more intuitive check. So you'll see we check back ace 9 a decent amount, and then we check back more often with top pair medium kicker. Let's look at the draws. Strong draws mostly get bet. So for instance, queen jack of diamonds basically always gets bet, and queen jack of hearts does as well, but queen jack of spades and clubs gets checked sometimes. And it's important that you mix it up because when you check behind, you still want to have the nuts. Let's say the turn is a king. If you don't have queen jack in your range, your opponent can just go completely mental and there's not much you can do about it. So the highest EV in a vacuum is to just bet because we have a good draw and fold equity. We want to build the pot, but we want to think about our entire strategy. Weaker draws generally get checked behind, but definitely not always. For instance, hand like 8-6. We now don't have a straight draw to do nuts anymore, and we don't have any overcards. So you'll see strong draws like 8-6 of diamonds get bet most of the time, hearts as well, but then the weaker versions get checked behind. You'll also see that the strong ace highs usually get checked behind because we have good showdown value. We dominate villains' weaker ace highs, but then some of the lower ones get bet, basically for protection because they unblock all of villain's straight draws, and then we can potentially turn them into a bluff on later streets. And then you'll see here that some of the medium hands get mixed. So all of the better draws get bet at a high frequency and the weaker draws get bet at a slightly lower frequency. And then we have some 3 flush, 3 straight hands that get bet a lot as well. So when the turn here is a queen and your king jacks, your queen jacks, your jack eights get there, you still want to have some bluffs. So jack 5 suited, for instance, is a good example of a hand you want to be betting with. Because when the straight draw gets there, you still have some bluffs. We're even checking back some really good hands sometimes, like pocket 10s. Mostly because with the 10, we block top pairs that call. Whereas with 9s and 4s, we do not. So you see here that 9s actually has an EV of 141, whereas pocket 10s has an EV of 129, because we will be unblocking hands that potentially call a 3-street barrel. And then we have one more type of bluff, which is the under pair or the bottom pair bluff. You'll see that 6s through 8s basically never get bet because they have pretty good showdown value. But hands like 3s and deuces have much less showdown value. So we sometimes bet these for protection and value against draws, and then when those draws get there, we can turn them into a bluff. These previous sims were button versus big blind examples. Let's look at a middle position versus big blind spot. So you'll see that we tend to be more polarized. So I picked ace-jack 4 flush draw. It's a board that hits both ranges quite hard. In position will have all the sets, whereas out of position doesn't have aces and jacks. But out of position still has some ace-4 suited, some ace-jack offsuits, ace-queens, all kinds of good draws, and not that much pure air. So you'll see here that in position chooses a large sizing again. I allowed it to bet 3/4 pot as well as 1/3 pot, and you see that, like in the 10-9-4 example, we bet big very often. So this is a board on which you could bet third pot with your full range, but you'll be giving up a decent amount of EV. If you feel very uncomfortable using a mixed strategy, then you can do it because you'll at least make fewer big mistakes. But if you know how to use the imposition freestyle strategy well, you'll be making a lot more money and you'll be forcing more mistakes by out of position as well. And as I said, it's much easier to make a mistake being out of position than being in position. Because out of position, you cannot pot control as easily. I ran the sim again with only 75% pot, and let's see what's going on here. So because this board is very good for us, even better than 10-9-4 compared to out of position, we're c-betting at a higher frequency, around 64.5%. So all of our hands get c-bet at a higher frequency. So how does this mixed strategy work? You'll see that again, threes and deuces get bet a decent amount as a protection bet slash bluff. Most of our aces get bet because it's a board on which we don't have to worry too much about slow playing. So you'll see that even the weaker aces are still being bet at a somewhat high frequency. The only hands that really make sense as a check behind are the jacks because they don't get that much value and they also don't need that much protection. So you'll see that a hand like Jack 10 gets bet less often than King 10 because out of position can definitely have Queen 10 offsuit. He can definitely have King 10 offsuit as well. And some of the weaker jacks. So King 10 performs better than Jack 10. We'll be checking behind some hands like 10s and 9s because they're kind of like pocket 8s and 7s on the 10-9-4 board where they don't get much value and they also don't need as much protection. Kings and queens also don't need much protection, so we're not going to be betting them that often either. And then we'll be bluffing with some of the fours because if out of position has worse than a 4 by the river, he's going to bluff his hand anyway, and we can't really call down. So we might as well just bet our hand for protection and turn it into a bluff, blocking his only set and blocking ace 4. We'll be betting again with most of our strong draws, but not always. So you see right here, a hand like King, Queen of Spades still does get checked back sometimes. Diamonds get bet more often even. But then hearts and clubs get checked back around 25% of the time. And if you look at weaker draws, they also get checked behind sometimes. And like 7-6 of spades, for instance, gets checked back 25% of the time, even though we have no showdown value as well as a flush draw. So mixing it up here really is key. And you'll see that the same concepts apply in both the Ace-Jack 4 and the 10-9-4 example. So if you know the concepts, you can apply them in every spot. The last example is 7-6-5 flush draw, button big blind again. And you'll see that this board is very bad for us because it's so good for out of position, and therefore we don't see bet very often. Out of position could have 8-9 offsuit. He'll have every set, 4-3 suited, maybe 8-4 suited, 2 pairs, lots of overcards, flush draws. It's again a board on which out of position doesn't have nothing very often. Unlike King 4-3, on which out of position just has hands like 10-9 offsuit that have almost no equity. So here, checking behind good hands is far more important than on Ace-Jack 4. So it's far easier to make a mistake on this board. You'll see the same tendencies once again, but this time in a more extreme form. So you see here that most of the good showdown hands like ace highs and king highs are being checked behind. The high overpairs are even checked behind sometimes because they are one pairs that don't need much protection. Whereas a hand like pocket tens, for instance, is kind of the same as pocket aces, but it needs a lot more protection. So we're betting every hand at a lower frequency, even our draws. So a hand like king, queen of hearts now is only being bet 20% of the time. A hand like ace, king of hearts is being bet even less. But then a hand like ace 4 of hearts is being bet quite often because we have less showdown value and we also have the open ender now. And lots of overcard hands that have a little bit of equity are being checked behind as well because they just want to realize their equity and not get check raised. For instance, a hand like Queen 10 of spades. We don't have good backdoors. Our blockers are not particularly important. So we tend to just check behind most of the time and try to see a turn and river. And then we can still have lots of delay c-bets, especially because a lot of villains lead out quite face up. They lead out most of their good hands and they don't check strong enough. So we can delay c-bet at a pretty high frequency. But more about that in a minute. So to recap, on the very dry and good boards, we can c-bet our full range. On the boards that are good for both players, we c-bet a polarized range. When we move towards a tight range spot, we c-bet a bit more polarized because both ranges are stronger. Whereas if both ranges are very wide, we can c-bet a bit more. So we can simplify our strategy or choose to freestyle. And I prefer freestyling when in position. We can simplify our strategy on boards. We can c-bet at a near 100% frequency, or we can freestyle, which I prefer when in position. Let's look at how to combat this check raise strategy starting from the turn. Onto the turn. Key to playing the turn well is mostly building the pot with a polarized range. On the king 3-4 board, we c-bet a very depolarized range, which means we lost value with a lot of hands in our range. So now it's time to get value back and build the pot and potentially take your opponent's entire stack. You also have to mix it up well. We c-bet a lot of hands that didn't improve their equity and they now want to check behind, or hands that had a little bit of value on the flop but not enough to bet the turn with, so we want to check them behind as well. Which means we have to check back other good hands in order to not be face up when facing river aggression. And I'm going to look at what to do when facing a barrel after the check raise. On king 4-3, we c-bet our entire range. Let's have a look at what to do against check raises. So because we are c-betting a lot, out of position responds by check raising a lot, which means we also have to do a lot of calling. So against a high frequency check raise, we don't fold a whole lot. We're only folding around 33%, which means that for out of position, we can actually over check raise because in position tends to not defend enough. But that's a topic for the out of position video. So we're defending every pair, obviously. We're defending every good ace high backdoor flush draw. You'll see that some of the offsuit aces get folded. And then we're floating most of the 3 flush, 3 straight hands. So just remember, high frequency bet means high frequency check raise by out of position, means high frequency call against a check raise. Now in position just calls, and we pick a safe turn. So out of position obviously checks. Why would you lead on the 10? And you'll see that we basically only overbet. We sometimes use a 3/4 pot sizing, but it's a bit easier if you only use one sizing, because otherwise you'll have to worry about putting strong as well as weak hands in both sizes. The third pot bet doesn't really make sense. We now want to get lots of value. If we bet small with hand like king queen on the flop, we lost value. We ideally just want to bet like full pot. So now we get back value that we lost on the flop. So you'll see that we're overbetting our kings at a high frequency and then checking back our weaker kings sometimes. Hands like pocket queens and jacks tend to get checked behind again. They're not too different from middle pairs, except they need way less protection. And then you'll see that most of our high equity draws get bet. Hands like queen jack, for instance, here with diamonds, we're betting extremely often. And then the other varieties get checked. But because queen jack has so much equity, we don't have to check this hand behind too often. We can first start by checking behind weaker draws, such as, for instance, 6-7, which only has a gut shot, not an open-ender. And so we only have a gut shot, and the 6 and the 7 likely do not give us the best hand. Once out of position calls the overbet, a 6 and a 7 likely are not clean pairouts, whereas a queen and a jack could be. We're also making a couple of very light mergey bets, which is something that the player pool doesn't really do. So for instance, we're betting with hands like Jack 5 suited. And usually when we bet these types of strange hands is because we'll be unblocking folds. So when you make these lower equity bluffs, you generally want to unblock hands that opponents fold and hands that can improve and block your own value hands on the river. If the card is a bit more dry, like a 5, now we just tend to bet 3/4. So we're saying our range is polarized for betting. At the same time, we acknowledge that out of position has more 2 pairs now. It has ace deuce offsuit, maybe 6-2 suited, pocket 5s, whereas on the 10, out of position doesn't have pocket 10s for a set. So on this card, we bet a bit smaller and we check back more often. So basically, the cleaner the card, the more often we bet and the bigger we bet. So on all the low cards, we bet 3/4 spot, and on the high cards, we tend to overbet. Once we call the check raise and face the 10, you'll see that out of position tends to bet large with a polarized range. And we tend to be quite tight. So we call the flop quite light, but now once out of position only bets 19% of the time and overbets, we can fold quite often. So you'll see that we're still calling with our kings because not only is our hand near the top of our range, but it's difficult for out of position to have a lot of equity. But then we're folding a lot of the medium strength hands that block out of position's bluffs. For instance, pocket 6s and pocket 5s block straight draws that out of position is going to bluff with. And then we're calling mostly with our stronger draws, but we'll be folding our weaker draws. So obviously, we are never folding with an ace-high flush draw, like a 6 of diamonds, for instance, because we could have the best hand, our ace could be live, and we have 9 nuts to the nut flush. Unless villain has a set, then we have slightly fewer outs, of course. But that's only 4s and 3s, so that's a very small percentage of out of position's range. Back to 10-9-4 flush draw. So we bet full pot on the flop, which means that out of position is not going to be check raising as much because in position is representing a polarized range. And then you'll see we're defending again with every 9 and 10, and we're defending with our straight draws as well. Here we don't have to defend with many really weak ace highs and stuff like that because out of position's range is much more polarized for check raising. But in this example, out of position is merely going to call, and we'll pick a safe card. So on the 3, you'll see just like on the 10 in the king 4-3 example, we tend to only overbet. So you'll see in basically every spot, when the turn is a clean card, we just go with an overbet or check strategy. Whereas if the card is mediocre or bad, then we go with a smaller bet. So if you bet a very good hand on the flop, why would you slow down on the turn? Because the turn doesn't improve out of position at all. So you see that we're still betting with most of our top pairs. We're bet checking with top pair as well sometimes, so that on the river we can face aggression. You'll see we're again bluffing with some hands that unblock his fold. So you see, for instance, hands like King 5 get bluffed sometimes because we're unblocking a lot of the middling hands that are going to be folding. And then we're betting with most of our draws again because it's just a board on which your range wants to keep betting a lot. On a scary card like the 7 of diamonds, you see we slow down. So instead of checking in the 30s, now we're checking in the 60s. And instead of overbetting, now we're mostly using a 3/4 pot sizing. So you see that now our top pairs get checked back quite often, and we're betting mostly with 2 pairs, sets, straights, and our higher equity draws, and then some bluffs as well, of course. So basically, we're doing the same thing, but all of it at a lower frequency. So the same, so again, similar to the king 4-3, we overbet, blanks, and then we slow down on the connecting cards. Now that offsuit 5 was of course way less scary than the 7 of diamonds because out of position has tons of flushes, tons of jack 8s, 8-6s, 10-7s, 9-7s, you know, good hands like king of diamonds 9, let's say. So we have to be very careful here. When calling a check raise, out of position can bet a polarized range on the 3, and you'll see we're fast playing a lot. So on boards on which we need a lot of protection and our value hands are still looking quite good, we can fast play a lot. So on king 4-3, it's much more difficult for villain to have a lot of equity, which means that fast playing is less important. But here, out of position will have a ton of equity, so we want to fast play as much as we can. Of course, we still want to have good hands in our calling range in order to not get run over on the river. So you'll see, for instance, hands like pocket tens get called. Hands like ace king of diamonds with overcards, potential showdown value, and then a flush draw do get called. And then we keep on calling with our 10s and 9s because we're near the top of our range and we'll be unblocking most of his bluffs. On ace jack 4, you'll see the same thing happening. We bet a polarized range, which means that out of position is not going to be check raising a whole lot because in position is doing so well and we've checked behind some of our weaker hands. So versus the strong in position c-bet range, out of position doesn't want to raise too often. So you'll see here we're calling with all of our aces again because we're near the top of our range and it's difficult for villain to have a ton of equity. And then once we do bet hands like kings and queens, we tend to just call, not only because we have a good hand, but when, let's say, the turn is something like the jack of spades, we can turn our hand into a bluff and it will look like we have no bluffs. Some of our weaker hands now get folded. A lot of them were already being checked behind on the flop anyway. So we call, and then on the blank turn, the 6, you'll see once again that in position overbets. And since we bet a polarized range to begin with, most of that range wants to keep on betting. So you'll see that we bet check now sometimes with some aces that cannot get any more value and they want to strengthen our check behind range. And then obviously we keep on betting with our nutted hands like 6s, 4s, jacks. You'll be surprised that aces get bet basically always. And the reason is that we keep on betting a polarized range, but we check back aces a decent amount on the flop. So if we go back to the flop, you'll see we're checking behind around 20% of the time. But once we do bet, we want to keep on betting. And then we bet with some hands as a mergey bluff, like a 4 again. We can bluff with underpair sometimes. And then we bluff with most of our premium draws while checking back our weaker draws. But you still want to bet those weaker draws sometimes in order to have bluffs when the good draws get there. And also, otherwise, out of positions blockers will become too powerful when you always bluff exactly the same hands. On the 9 of spades, you'll see that we slow down quite a bit because out of position has a bunch of flushes. It can have ace 9 suited, jack 9 suited. It just has a lot of high equity hands, like let's say king of spades queen, king of spades 10, etc. So we have to be quite careful. So we keep on betting all the same hands, but now at a very, very low frequency. So I'm feeling a bit like a broken record, just repeating myself, but you'll see that all of these concepts keep on coming back. So if you remember them, you can apply them to any future spots. So even if you take them to another game, like Pot Limit Omaha, you'll see that the same concepts apply. Good boards in Hold'em are generally good boards in PLO as well. For instance, ace-high boards are good because in position is representing a stronger range than out of position. When getting check raised on this flop with villain betting big on the turn, you'll see we're fast playing a lot again. So similar to the 10-9-4-3 board, we have a lot of very good hands that need quite a bit of protection. So that means we're going to fast play quite often. Whereas on King 4-3-10, the board is already a bit more dry. If it were something like King 4-3-3, we can slow play even less often because now out of positions bluffs will have fairly low equity. So protection will not be as important. So we are mostly fast playing our good hands, which unblock in positions value range. So you'll see that a hand like jacks will be fast played basically every time because we unblock the ace, but aces is always being called, or basically always being called, because we block more hands like ace 4 and ace queen, etc. And then we're folding with hands that block bluffs, the medium strength hands like kings and queens. And we can even start folding some aces now because out of position already check raises a very polarized range and is now betting into and out of position is betting into us on a board that hits us very hard, so his range is very strong, which means we don't have to defend anymore with hands that are near the bottom to middle of our range. On 7-6-5, we see bet a polarized range. Out of position still check raises a lot because it's just such a good board for out of position. When you play in an early position versus big blind spot, it's a little bit better for you because now out of position definitely does not have 8-9 offsuit anymore, and it doesn't have hands like 6-7 offsuit anymore. Then we both only have the suited combos, and out of position will even 3-bet 8-7, 8-9 suited sometimes, whereas in position will always raise it. So when you are in the earlier positions, this board is actually a little bit better for you. Out of position, still check raises a lot, especially button big blind. So in position does call a lot, and you'll be surprised. You'll maybe think, why are we calling so much? And that is because we see bet a very polarized range to begin with. Now, if we see bet this board 75-80% of the time, then we would be folding a lot more. But of our polarized range, we don't want to fold much because a lot of the medium value hands and no equity hands are already being checked behind. And then you'll see the same things that we're just calling with our pairs. They're usually going to be good pairs because, again, we would have checked back the medium ones, and we'll be calling our premium draws and our premium floats only. But what about a call? On clean cards, you'll see the same thing happening, but to be fair, which card is clean here? A deuce of diamonds, I guess, is a clean card. On that card, we can do the same thing as on the other boards, just bet big with a polarized range. But the deuce is literally the only clean card. A 5 is somewhat clean. A 5 is somewhat clean. So you'll see that we mostly bet 3/4 pot. The 5 is not a huge part of out of positions range. At the same time, we still have to worry about it a little bit. So you see we just bet 3/4 pot. And then when the card is more of a good card for in positions range, we can be more aggressive. So you see that, for instance, on a queen of diamonds, we can be quite aggressive because in position is going to be c-betting some of the queen high, jack high, 10 high type of cards, but out of position is not going to call too many of them. It's mostly calling the lower stuff or the ace high, king high type of stuff. So here we're betting quite aggressively. And you'll see that we're betting with most of our good hands. We're checking back some occasionally. So we're checking back some of our weaker pairs, for instance. We're even checking back some of our flush draws, but our strongest hands not really. So you'll see that, for instance, 8-9 and the sets always get bet. 4-3 always gets bet. But then hands like, for instance, jacks and 10s and 9s, which are similar to 8s and 9s on King 4-3-10, get checked behind again. And so since we're betting at a high frequency, we also bet our draws at a high frequency. And we'll be betting again with some of the hands that unblock folds. But to be fair, there's not too many of those. What do we do when facing a check raise and a double barrel? On the queen, we're not fast playing as much. So here you'll think, wait, this board is very draw heavy. Why are we not fast playing? And that's because draws have already completed, mainly the straight. So on ace jack 4-6, no straight draw has been completed, which means we fast play a lot. But here, since out of position can have all of the 8-9 offsuits and 4-3 suited and 8-4 suited, we want to be much more careful. So we basically fast play our best hands and our best draws only, and then a couple of mergy fluffy hands, but not really many. So there's a big difference between a board on which the straight or flush has gotten there and ones on which they haven't. Very important that you remember that. If we pick a safe card, again, we could pick a safe card, but that's only a deuce. On the deuce, it makes sense that out of position bets big, and then you'll see again, we don't really fast play much. On a scary card for out of position, it will slow down quite a bit, which means we have to raise quite often, even when draws have gotten there. So we don't have to raise too big here. And we're raising with most of our strong hands, but also slow playing some. So we're mostly slow playing hands that are extremely good and need less protection. And we fast play the slightly worse but still good ones that unblock villains' continuing range. So to recap your turn play, you saw that on clean cards, it's extremely important that we build the pot and get the value that we missed on the flop, and start moving towards an all-in situation on clean rivers, which we'll be covering shortly. You also have to mix it up by checking back lots of good stuff, and then the scarier the card, the more you have to mix it up and check behind. And when facing a double barrel after getting check raise and calling, you mostly fast play on the clean runouts, but you don't fast play much on boards on which draws have completed. And then you can start folding a lot of your medium value hands because you're not high up in your range anymore. And you likely won't have much equity against villains' value range. Most villains tend to under check raise the flop, which means we can already overfold a little bit, and we can also overfold the turn and under fast play because they're likely not bluffing enough. So just because Pile Solver tells you to fast play 15 to 20% doesn't mean that's correct in game if humans only check raise between 5 and 15% on a certain flop rather than 20 plus. And if they don't bet a lot of the weaker bluffs that Pile Solver will bet. So make sure to distinguish human play from Pile play here, which is a little bit of an art as well as a science. So it's really difficult to give you, so it's really difficult to tell you exactly how to adjust because every single villain is different. But mostly in the lower stakes games, people are too tight and too face up, which means it's best to be a little bit too tight rather than too loose when facing aggression. Onto the river. We'll be applying lots of pressure to a capped range. Similar to our turn play, we'll be using very large bets, especially on safe cards. I'm also going to look at bluff catching. We're mostly calling down based on hand strength and blockers. Now, the bigger the pot, the more your blockers matter because villain's range will be very narrow for value. So if you block, for instance, sets or straights and unblock potential bluffs, you can often call with relatively weak hands. We check back a lot in position, so we'll be facing lots of river probes. When villain bets with a pretty depolarized range, sometimes for 1/3 pot, we need to raise very wide and depolarize ourselves. Now, when we get check raised on the flop and face a bet shove, we're again calling down a tight range based on hand strength and blockers. So let's go to king 4-3 and see how that works on the river. On the turn, you saw that we overbet on the 10 of diamonds because it's such a safe card for in position. Out of position does not raise much because it's hard for out of position to improve on this card, and you generally don't need that much protection because the board is somewhat dry. So villain calls, and then on a safe card, you'll see that in position is going all in very, very aggressively, as thinly as king jack plus, basically, even king 9 and king 8 sometimes. Although, to be fair, that is not really realistic for human versus human play. King jack offsuit is going to be roughly the cutoff point. So you see we're going all in with a wide range for value here, even though we're betting large. We also have some smaller bets. Those are mostly our weaker value bets. For instance, hands like king jack, as well as some hands that are so good that they block out of position's calling range. For instance, a hand like pocket kings. We're going to be bluffing with mostly the lower stuff. So you see that hands like 7-5 suited get bluffed because they block the straight and they unblock the big flush draws that out of position is going to call, fold. And we're bluffing with some hands like jack 5 as well, blocking the straight. But the higher cards like queen jack, they're just usually being checked behind, especially if we have diamonds. So you see right here, queen jack of diamonds is being checked back 98% of the time. But then queen jack of hearts and queen jack of clubs are sometimes being bluffed. And then the lower showdown value hands like queen 9, queen 8 are being bluffed as well. If we pick a slightly scarier card, like the 9 of clubs, you'll see that we now mostly bet large. If we have a hand like ace king, we're still happily value betting, but our hand is not quite good enough to be going all in with for over twice the pot. We still have some all-ins. We have sets that villain cannot have. We have straights that villain is very unlikely to have. So now our bluffs also change. So we really want to block the big straight with hands like queen 8, jack 8, etc. and bet hands like 6-5 and 7-5, but probably not for an all-in sizing because you don't block the nuts. On a very tricky card, like the 9 of diamonds, where out of position has tons of king x of diamonds and unpaired flushes, you'll see that we're not nearly as comfortable value betting hands like ace king, aces, or even hands like 4-3 suited, which are even checking behind 4-3 suited. So now when we bluff, we want to block a diamond. A hand like queen 8, for instance, is really good for bluffing because we block the straight as well as the flush. Hands like 6-5, they block basically nothing. They block low flushes, but villain is not going to have too many of those. What about when we get check raised and face a bet and an all-in? So on the 10, you can expect villain to bet large. Against this large bet, we don't need to fast play very often because villain has such a strong range at this point and the board is still quite dry. So you saw that out of position doesn't check raise much against a very polarized bet. The same happens on this board. Sorry, the same happens when in position. So we call and the river is the deuce. You'll see that villain bets all in with a polarized range. So which hands are we bluff catching with? We're bluff catching based on hand strength. So you see that king 4, king 3, king deuce, king 10 are all being called. Our sets are being called. And then we're calling some hands like king 5, for instance, because we block 2 pair and we also block 5-6. But then a hand like king 7 doesn't block 5-6, and we're even blocking some hands like 7-5 that villain is going to bluff with. And then we can call with some hands like ace 4 because they block pocket 4s, they block ace 5, and you unblock all of the straight draws and even the flush draw. So you'll see here that we're calling a very weak hand, only third pair, but our blockers are so good that we call all in over a better hand like king 7. So when we check behind on the 10 of diamonds, on the 3, you'll see that villain is leading out quite often, around 40%, and often for the large sizing as well as the small sizing, because we're repping a couple of different types of hands. So against a larger bet, you'll see that we're not raising that much because villain is mostly representing a king, and once we check behind on the turn, we don't have that many hands that are better than a king because we don't really open raise many 3s. So which hands are we calling? If we have a king, we're obviously always calling based on hand strength. Hands like ace 10 are nice to call with because we unblock his obvious bluffs. But then but we're not calling hands like, for instance, pocket 6s nearly as often because we again block draws. So you see the same concepts apply. We call based on hand strength and based on unblocking villain's bluffs. But of course, you cannot just blindly call any hand that unblocks bluffs because then villain can just make lots of thinner value bets. We're raising, obviously, if we do have an occasional 3 or if we have a slow play. Against a small bet, we're going to be raising much more often because at this point, villain is repping few hands as good as a king or better. So now you'll see that our kings are being raised basically on 100% of the time. Even hands like ace 10 are strong enough to raise, and obviously we're folding far less. So now we simply cannot fold hands like 6s and 5s anymore because against such a small bet, we have to defend a lot of our range. And if we're folding decent pairs like those, we're just far over folding. Let's skip the ace-jack 4 and 10-9-4 boards because those boards get played exactly the same as king 4-3. On 7-6-5 queen, the board will change much more drastically because basically every river changes the board drastically. So we bet 3/4 pot on the queen. Out of position does not raise much. Any card except for a deuce is relevant. A 3 and a 4 complete the straight, an 8 and a 9 complete the straight, diamonds and hearts complete the flush. So how do we navigate different runouts? Just to illustrate, on the deuce, we will be betting aggressively because we've bet a regular sizing with even our strongest hands, and villain did not fast play. So we can have some huge bets, as well as some larger bets, but let's look at a more relevant card. On a really scary card like the 8 of diamonds, we have to slow down significantly because the straight got there, the flush got there, and villain has a bunch of both. So you see right here, once out of position checks, we're only using the large sizing. It's difficult to bet much worse than a straight at this point. So our range is polarized and we choose the large sizing, simply not at a really high frequency. And when we bluff, we want to block villain's best calling as well as raising hands. So the low card hands, such as Jack 10, for instance, are being bet a lot. So low card hands like Jack 10 are being bet quite often. With Jack 10, we're blocking the straight as well as the flush, and we have Jack high. What about a slightly less scary card? D4, bring the straight as well, but not the flush. So you see right now, we're still betting 3/4 pot, basically with the same range. On the ace, we're not interested in making thinner value bets anymore. Now we just want to be very, very polarized. It's very important that we look at how to combat check raises. We've called the queen of diamonds. And now on the deuce, out of position only goes all in, that makes sense. Let's see, So we are calling mostly based on hand strength. Hands like Queen 7, 7-6, etc. are being called. And then we're calling with hands that block the straight. So you'll see that pocket 9s is always being called, but pocket 8s are being folded. That might be a bit confusing. The reason is that out of position will check raise lots of open-enders. So by the river, he'll be bluffing with those open-enders, but he will not be check raising that many 9x. So with 9s, you'll be blocking the straight, but not the open-ended bluffs. With pocket 8s, you may be blocking the straight, but you're also blocking bluffs. So those hands have similar absolute hand strength, but 9s is a much better hand to be calling with. And you'll see that hands like Queen 9, for instance, are also being called because we block 2 pairs as well as the straight. We have to check back lots of different hands on the turn because the river will change the board. So we're going to face many different types of strategies. On a deuce, you'll see that out of position mostly block bets because out of position mostly has 7s, 6s, and 5s that may be interested in a small bet, but not in a large bet. So once out of position bets small, we have to raise quite often. So we're saying we probably don't have the nuts because we only check back, but we're still raising for thin value. So you see right here that, for instance, even a hand like, you'll see that medium strength hands like pocket 8s, pocket 9s are being raised for thin value. If we raise big, we cannot get value from worse hands like a 7, a 6, or a 5. But if we raise small, he's forced to call some of them. Now, if he were to bet larger, we would only call our hand because there's no more value to be gained with those hands, with our medium strength hands. And then we're still calling, obviously, with any 7 because we'll be beating or tying his value range, same as with something like a 6. A 5, we can sometimes choose to fold maybe, but definitely not a hand like ace 5 because we'll be unblocking all of his bluffs. So what about a scary card? On the 8 of diamonds, out of position, mostly bet small because it has a lot of medium strength hands it wants to bet, but it also has larger bets, of course. On the 3 of diamonds, out of position is mostly betting larger, but also smaller sometimes. There's a lot of medium strength hands in out of positions range as well as good hands. So we obviously don't raise very often against this bet size because at this point we cannot even value raise with a 2-pair type of hand anymore. So you see right here we're mostly calling even with our 4x. So an 8-9 we would have bet on the turn. So at this point we're only representing a flush, making us want to raise big and not small. So against these small leads, you have to raise with a depolarized range, whereas against these bigger leads, we're only raising occasionally, but generally for a very large sizing, assuming we actually have good hands that can back that up. On a really bad card for out of position, such as the ace, obviously we're checking a lot. On a good card, you bet a lot. On a bad card, you check a lot. That makes sense intuitively. So since we're checking a lot, we're also mixing it up by checking some hands like pocket 5s, let's say. Because pocket 5s unblocks the ace that's going to be betting the river, and then you can check raise huge and make him think about betting twice next time when he has either a bluff or a thinner value bet, such as maybe ace 3. We're also checking our medium strength hands, of course, because if villain still has a lot of medium strength hands, then why would you be betting with hand which is slightly worse? So how do we combat that as imposition? Since out of position doesn't lead out very often, when it does, it is polarized, so we're not raising a whole lot. We can just expect a lot of checks on the ace. And when we do get checked to, we mostly pick a large but not huge sizing. You want to be careful not to put too much money into the pot when your opponent's range still contains a bunch of traps, because on the ace, we have way more good hands than out of position, but we have far fewer really good hands. So if you bomb it, you allow villain to fold a lot of medium strength hands, and put more money in the pot when he's trapping you. So whenever you got a capped range, be very careful not to bet too big and get check raised huge. I think that a lot of opponents, especially at lower stakes, don't mix up their play well enough. So against them, you can value bet a little bit more thinly. So just to recap, we are applying lots of pressure to his capped range on safe runouts. We are bluff catching thinly versus small bets, and we raise a lot, but then we raise less often versus large bets. When check two, we generally use some kind of medium sizing because we're saying our hand is medium strength. We don't have too many nutted hands once we've checked behind the turn. And when bluff catching, we are mostly calling based on hand strength as well as our blockers. And the bigger the pot, the more important your blockers become, because villain's range will be very narrow. So blocking potential value bets and unblocking bluffs usually means you have a very good calling hand. Then to finish it off with some tips. The game tree is very large when playing in position single raise pots, which means that villains will play very differently. So if you just use one strategy against all of them, you're leaving a lot of money out on the table. So play your basic strategy, but if you see villain doing something wrong, and he will, as will you have to adjust, especially when you're playing lower stakes. A lot of villains are too nitty, too face up. They don't really mix up their play enough. So you can exploit them, usually by being overly aggressive. Then make sure to be careful with single street exploits. This is extremely important, and I would almost like to devote an entire video to it. So let's say we open raise much wider on the button because villain is too tight in the big blind. So we open, let's say 50, maybe even 60% in the button, and the big blind calls too tight. Now you can't blindly bet good boards for your range anymore because our range is so much wider and his is so much tighter. So you cannot simply copy the Pio-Sim. So you cannot exploit pre-flop, but then still play your standard strategy on the flop. It means you'll have to tighten up. And then the last tip is that when playing in position, your play is similar everywhere. So if you play button big blind, it's very similar to under the gun big blind. Ranges are a bit tighter under the gun, so you tend to be a bit more polarized. But the same concepts still apply. So ace, king, queen high boards are very good for in position. The middling boards are very good for out of position. On boards where both players hit good hands, we generally want to be more polarized as well. A board like 5, 6, 7 is maybe a little bit better for out of position when playing versus the button, because then he may have 8, 9 offsuits, but not versus under the gun. So you'll see that some boards become a little bit more favorable for the big blind or for in position, but it will not change that much. Now, that was the end of the video. I hope you all learned something. This was MMA Sherdog for the Bluff to Spot High Stakes course. Good luck at the tables.